Lisa.
Thanks for joining us. Look, I want to talk about software companies. This is your coverage universe. Which of the companies that you are actively covering has the most exposure to Japan?
Sure. So let's just set the stage a second. I mean, software revenue, worldwide software revenue, Japan's about 7 or 8% of the total market. So I think that's the context. You've got companies that range between about 0% of that and about 15% of their business coming from Japan. The few that come to mind, the one that in our universe has the most exposure is Adobe Systems. They do between 10 and 15% of their revenue in Japan, depending on the quarter. A few others we put on that list: Autodesk, that makes design automation software, and Salesforce.com, that makes an application software service. Actually, those are the three that have the highest exposure in our universe.
Walter, how can you separate out what is exposure specifically to Japan as it relates to a company's operations, and what is just a sell-off throughout the market?
I think it's virtually impossible in a market like this, whereas just listening to the earlier segment here, people are reacting minute by minute to events over in Japan, and unfortunately, and so I think it's very hard. We do our best to try to estimate just what the revenue exposure is and go from there. But I think isolating that impact on stock prices over the last 3 days has been pretty tough.
Now, Adobe, you mentioned that your coverage universe has 13% exposure in terms of revenue to Japan. They report next week. Do you expect them to comment on Japan, and have they given any guidance in advance of that earnings report?
They have. So the only guidance they've given guidance for the just recently closed February quarter. They've also talked about their expectation for May quarter to be up in terms of revenue sequentially. I think it's going to be virtually impossible for them on Tuesday not to address the question proactively. I think it's we estimate 15% of the business in the May quarter coming from Japan. I think they almost have to reflect it directly in the guidance that they're going to give for the quarter.
There are some good things, though, potentially that are baked into their numbers, are there not? I mean, there was a big issue with Flash, but it looks like they've moved past that. Sure. I mean, absolutely. I think just everything else equal, though, I think there is certainly an impact, and we are bullish on the shares for that reason and a number of the other positive reasons that we see in terms of drivers of the numbers. But I think it's just undeniable that there's some sort of impact there, and we look forward to them quantifying it. They've been pretty mum here just in the few days before the earnings. So no real specific commentary out of the company. Just sort of our work around estimating the impact. Now let's talk about two different companies, Salesforce.com and also Autodesk, right? You have a hold on Salesforce.com, and you downgraded Autodesk earlier in the year from a buy.
Correct. I mean, I think, obviously neither of those fundamental calls really have anything to do with Japan. I think with Autodesk, we just saw a company who, the market has begun to price in, what we think is probably an overly optimistic macro recovery scenario. The stock, has had a great run and has run to basically 2 times the S&P multiple, which we see as a relative peak on the shares historically among times of good macro news. So that was the reason for the change there. Salesforce really more of an issue for us around valuation. I think, there's nothing really fundamental in the business that concerns us at the moment. Expectations are high, valuation's high. I think that's really the only concern on that one.
Overall for software companies, Walter, as we look out through the rest of the year and we get through events in Japan, what do you think is going to happen? Are you going to start revising your price targets at this point? We've started to see some economists revisiting their GDP forecast, but haven't heard too much from single stock analysts revising price forecasts yet.
Sure. I think, really for us, I mean, software tends to be it tends to be an industry that really stacks up in the second half of the year. So, I think to the extent that we become more comfortable with higher growth, I think you'd see that more in the second half of the year. But as it stands today, I think we've got pretty realistic scenarios in our numbers. I'd say for the most part, we're slightly ahead of consensus in terms of our forecast for revenue growth and profits, and we're comfortable with that at this time.
All right, Walter, thanks so much for joining us. I'm glad it worked the second time around.
Yeah, me too.
Walter Pritchard, Citigroup analyst.